Shalom, good evening, and welcome to Alma. I'm Natan Golan, and I have the honor of being chairman of the Alma Center's International Advisory Board. Thank you all for joining us today from all around the world. It's exciting to connect with you, and it's also truly inspiring to see thousands of views on our webinars over the past 2 weeks. So thank you for helping our community of friends and supporters to continue to grow. As you may know, Alma is the leading Israeli think tank focusing on Israel's security challenges on her northern borders. Now, at this point, I want to emphasize to those that don't know that Alma is a completely independent and autonomous organization. We are an Israeli nonprofit, and all of our viewpoints, analysis, and comments are totally non-partisan and impartial. During these uncertain and even crazy times, where international travel and visiting Israel is not yet an option, these Alma webinars is our way of bringing Israel's northern borders into your home. Our topic of discussion this evening is quite special since this month marks the 20 years to the Israeli withdrawal from southern Lebanon. Also, we will use this session to expose an exclusive report today. We've been working on this report for the past few months, and we believe it will make a significant contribution to the monitoring of the Shiite terror group Hezbollah and their deployment in civilian infrastructure in Lebanon. Our speakers today will be Lieutenant Colonel Sarit Zahavi, the CEO and founder of Alma, and Ort Kitri, a senior fellow at FDD, the Foundation for Defense and Democracies, and a law professor at Arizona State University. You may ask questions during this webinar. If you're using Zoom, please post your question in the Q&A section below. And if you're using Facebook, just write your questions in the comment section. And don't forget to tell us your name and where you are from. To begin with, I'd like to give you a brief snapshot of about Hezbollah's military deployment in Lebanon. In the past 14 years since the last war with Hezbollah in the summer of 2006, it has developed an artillery arsenal of about 130,000 missiles, hidden primarily in populated areas all over Lebanon, Beirut, the Bekaa Valley, and of course, in South Lebanon. The range of these rockets reaches almost every corner in Israel, although most of them are inaccurate. Over the past few years, Iran, together with Hezbollah, have made significant efforts in promoting and building precision-guided rockets project, or as we refer to them, PGM. First of all, Iran built factories in Syria, and after they were attacked and destroyed by the Israeli Air Force, it began to build them in Lebanon. In the United Nations General Assembly, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu presented 3 sites in Beirut that were used for the PGM project. Today, it is estimated that approximately some tens or hundreds of PGMs are already in the hands of Hezbollah. Today, we want to discuss the way Hezbollah uses the population in Lebanon as a human shield to hide the storage facilities as well as the rocket factories, and what could be done to stop this crime. Yes, it is a crime in accordance to international law. Lieutenant Colonel Sarit Zahavi is the CEO and founder of Alma. She has briefed hundreds of groups and forums, ranging from US senators, congressmen and women, and politicians, prominent journalists, and visiting VIP groups, both here in Israel and overseas. Sarit scripts and publishes numerous position papers and updates focusing on Lebanon, Syria, and Israel's national security challenges. She served for 15 years in the Israeli Defense Forces, specializing in military intelligence. Sarit holds an MA in Middle East Studies from Ben-Gurion University, and she lives with her husband Yaron, together with their 5 children, in the community of Kfar Vadim, located in the Western Galilee. So I'd like to begin by asking Sarit. The Alma Center wrote a detailed report about the suspected locations of Hezbollah medium-range missiles deployed in southern Beirut that directly exploit civilian populations as human shields. I would appreciate it if you could share with us some of the highlights from your report.
Thank you very much, Nathan. I must say that I am highly excited today because our report and I'm now sharing the screen of the presentation. Our report is, we have been working on this report in the past few months. And the work is not completely done. I hope that it will be done in the next week and we will be able to publish the full report next week, but it's a lot of work. So today I'm going to just give you some of the details of the report, some examples, and actually a taste of what was done. Before we start to talk about the initial findings, I want to say one word about the ideology behind it, or the strategy behind it, or the tactic behind it, which is named Human Shield. We named this webinar Hezbollah Strategy 2020, every point, every hill, every village, every house, and every area served as a front line. These words were said by Soleimani, the commander of Quds Force that was assassinated in Iraq only 6 months ago. He actually was the head of the Iranian military presence in Iraq and Syria. He was the engineer and manager of the new control and power and influence of Iran in these two countries in the past years. And he described very clearly, and afterwards more speakers of Hezbollah said actually the same words just 2 weeks ago, that this is the logic, that everything is useful for the goal, and the goal is the Islamic Revolution of Iran, spreading it, fighting the Sunnis and fighting Israel. Why Human Shield? What do they gain out of that? It's kind of a circle. They position the weapons inside inhabited areas, inside populated areas, and in a minute I'll show you some examples. This is something that is, by the way, being used also by Hamas in Gaza. It's not new, but I always say that Hezbollah are the professors and Hamas are the students. Hezbollah is much more sophisticated than Hamas. It is doing that in a much more concealed way. You will not find Nasrallah telling its people to die while they are presenting themselves as human shields, but the rockets are inside the homes, no doubt about that. The moment you put the rockets in their home, you pose direct danger to the civilians, and that way Hezbollah knows and assess that there would be limitations for preemptive attacks by Israel, whether during war or in what we call today the gray zone, meaning the campaign between the wars. And that's exactly, by the way, the reason why you can see Israeli attacks in Syria, which are happening by Syrian reports, I don't know, all the time, every week, every 2 weeks. Due to the reports in Syria, in opposed to Lebanon, where we haven't seen these kind of attacks yet, except for one report of Hezbollah about something of the sort, not airplanes, something else, much more tactical in Beirut last August. But the understanding of both sides, Hezbollah and the IDF, is that while the ammunition is hidden inside civilian areas, it is a problem to attack it. And also during war, here in Alma Center, you can see the screens behind me. We are having a simulation that part of the simulation discuss this issue of collateral damage. And this is exactly the dilemma that IDF will face in wartime, that we understand, and IDF understands that the Israelis should be protected. There is no doubt. But actually, what do you do if there is also a high chances of collateral damage on the Lebanese side? And we know that in the past, including 2006 Lebanese war, we suffered from huge international pressure because of collateral damage. And Hezbollah take advantage of this fact and actually moved most of its assets from what we used to call the nature reserves into the homes, into the villages and in Beirut as well, using the people in Beirut as human shields. Before we go to Beirut, which is the focus of the report, I want to show you an example of what happened to a warehouse that exploded. IDF published a few videos like that of explosion of a warehouse, this time in South Lebanon. I'm moving fast forward. This is the smoke that comes out of the warehouse, and Hezbollah that already experienced 2 times Israeli tracing the evacuation efforts is now covering the roof to conceal what is happening. And then during the night, we saw the remove of the ammunition from the warehouse, bringing it to a nearby other building, and then unloading the long objects that you can see now into a new building, and others were transferred elsewhere on side roads to bypass the UN presence and then get to a mosque. You can see this is the mosque, that's the dome and the tower in Nabatia, which is outside the UN area of operation. Of course, Beirut as well is outside the UN area of operation. What's the usage of all of these rockets? Nasrallah explained that very clearly. I'm not going to give you the sound, but I will explain what he's showing. Nasrallah said very clearly, you can still hear me, Nathan?
Yes.
Okay, Nasrallah said very clearly that, and he presented the map. This is an interview from last July, that all these civilian infrastructure of Israel is under threat by Hezbollah. And Hezbollah already marked the targets in Israel, which are the power plants and the desalination factories and electricity factories and infrastructure, and the airports and seaports, and the Knesset, and I don't know what else. And you can see very clearly the map that he is pointing at, his words, most populated area of Israel. So it's launching, the strategy is to launch rockets from populated areas to populated areas using missiles that are for a range of about 300 kilometers, weigh about half a ton, 500 kilos. I'm sorry for the miscalculation with the pounds or with the American measures. Fatah 11-0 or 110 are the Hezbollah version to these M600 missiles. And the problem is that these missiles are positioned inside the populated areas. These missiles are not the accurate missiles that you mentioned in the opening, but Hezbollah is trying to make these missiles accurate. And when they're stored in Beirut, they can get easily to Tel Aviv. That's the ranges here in the region, okay? Everything is very close. This area is very small. And that's why it's very useful for Hezbollah. In the photo that you can see next to the red square, this is a photo that we found in Syria just last week. And this is an example of the missiles over there. So what happened to us, to Alma? When I've started Alma, I was an intelligence officer, and I knew that to find a military deployment of Hezbollah in open sources, for me, it was impossible. This is something for intelligence. And yet, after I've met Ord, I understood that it is highly important to try to find information like that in open sources. And also my head of research department, Tal, told me, Sarit, let's give it a try. It's worth trying. Personally, I didn't believe we would find anything. And actually, it was impossible to find anything about South Lebanon. We didn't find open sources information about where the rockets are, but we found a database, and you can see in the map where the sites are. This is Beirut. What you see, Dahia, that's the same area of Beirut in the southern part that was attacked by Israel in 2006, because this is the area where Hezbollah is based. Everybody in the IDF knows that. Everybody in Israel knows that. And the database that we have found in open sources actually brings a few tens of sites that it is claimed that these sites are sites of rocket launch, sites of launching, storages, assembly, etc. for these Fatah 110. We made a research about the sources, about who created the database, about the sites, and we concluded that most of the sites make sense and that the information is reliable, thanks to the fact that we analyzed who exactly published it, what he tried to expose, and what he tried to conceal. And when we made the balance of these two issues, we could assess the reliability of the information. And all in all, in our report, we have about 28 launch sites and about three more sites, which are the same sites exactly that Netanyahu exposed in the UN a year and a half ago of the PGM project in Beirut, not far from the airport. You can see them in the map there. And which is also contributed to our belief that this information is reliable, because they presented in some of these sites, the same sites that Netanyahu presented in the UN. I was asked this question, so I would say it right now. We honestly couldn't trace who is the source. We could trace what's its interest, what he was trying, as I've said, to expose and conceal. It may be somebody who wanted to expose Hezbollah. There was, by the way, somebody else who wanted to conceal that, but we don't know exactly who it could be. Yes, it could be the Americans, it could be the Israelis, it could be other opponents of Hezbollah in Lebanon or maybe even in Syria. Hezbollah has tons of, it could be the Saudis, tons of opponents, but no doubt that this is a very interesting database. And I would just want, these are the sites that Netanyahu exposed in the UN, and it's the same site in the database that we have found. And I want to show you three more. As I've said, there are 28. I chose three that I thought that it's easy to explain and to show, but most of the sites look the same. So the red polygon on our image is the way it is look like in the database, while the green shapes in the image are our analysis of what exactly is happening in the neighborhood of the site, which is highly important, because if it's a launch site, you need a place, an open place to launch from, which is probably the soccer field. And actually the area next to the soccer field is an area where you can store the rockets. And you can see that just nearby you have an high school, which is actually your defense from the Israeli attacks against this kind of a place, because everything is very close. By the way, one of the sites that Netanyahu exposed as well in the UN of the PGM project was also a soccer field. And Lebanon trying to send the message now, to deny what Netanyahu presented, invited ambassadors and reported to the place and showed them 2 days later, of course, after it was evacuated, that there is nothing there. I was surprised that none of the reporters that visited the site asked one very simple question. Whose soccer team? It's a soccer field. Whose soccer team? And the answer is clear, of course. This is Al-Ahad. It's a Hezbollah soccer team. And that's why it is making it so easy to use the soccer field when it's your own team. The same logic of the human shield is the logic of the involvement of Hezbollah in the population and the Hezbollah civilian system, which is, by the way, our topic to the next for the next webinar next week. Here is another, that's the images of how this place looks like, how the high school looks like from the ground. You see how crowded all these buildings are, which are just next to the soccer field, how dangerous it is. The next site is next to a church. You can see very clearly the design of a church. That's the backyard. The red square, again, it's how it looks like in the database, while the green area is our understanding of the compound. And nearby, not only a church, but also a clinic. This is how the church looks like from inside. And the third example is this place, again, very crowded place in Beirut. And you can see KFC nearby. For those of you who like KFC, I don't like it personally. High school, and that's the launching site. And that's very natural because it's between the trees, it's open area, it's easy to launch, it's easy to hide the rockets in this building surrounding. And that's how it looks like from the ground. Very easy to do it. Very, I don't know. And this is just 3 examples out of the 28. So that's just the case from our report. I'm passing the microphone to you, Nathan.
Sorry, thank you very much. Those are very powerful images that you shared with us. And I think
Unmute yourself.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. Okay, I'm not on mute. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that with us. That was very enlightening and also to an extent very shocking. We're going to move on now to our second speaker. I'm sure there will be questions to you, Sarit, about your expose. Or Kitri is a senior fellow at FDD, the Foundation for Defense and Democracies, and a law professor at Arizona State University. He's based in Washington, D.C., and is recognized as a leading expert on international law, particularly as it relates to the Middle East. Ord is the author of Lawfare, Law as a Weapon of War, which describes how and why the law is becoming an increasingly powerful and prevalent weapon of war through examples of lawfare used by the United States, China, Israel, the Palestinians, as well as non-governmental organizations and individuals. Ord played a leading role in advising Congress as it unanimously passed and subsequently signed by the president a US law that for the first time requires publicly listing and penalizing Hamas and Hezbollah terrorists and their supporters for the use of human shields. Before entering academia, Ord served for 11 years at the Department of State, where he received both the department's Superior Honor Award and its Meritorious Honor Award as well. He's also served as a consultant to the US Department of Defense. Ord, thank you so much for being with us this evening. First of all, can you tell us a little bit about the legislation that you promoted?
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here. I read the report with great interest. This is a very important topic. The use of civilians to shield otherwise lawful military objectives from attack during armed conflict is a war crime, as was mentioned. This is commonly referred to as the use of human shields. The use of human shields is a clear violation of international law. It's prohibited by the Geneva Conventions. Nevertheless, we've seen that terrorists' use of human shields has proven to be a remarkably effective tactic against countries like the United States and against Israel, whose ethical and military codes require avoiding civilian casualties. In response to that, we came up with an idea and we worked with Congress. In 2018, Congress unanimously passed and the president signed into law in December 2018, legislation that for the first time requires publicly listing and penalizing specific terrorists and their supporters for the use of human shields. The new law requires annual reporting and the imposition of penalties on persons and entities involved with the use of human shields by Hamas and Hezbollah. The new law also authorizes the president to impose sanctions on other persons and entities involved with the use of human shields, such as the Islamic State. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about why terrorists engage in this, how the law is designed to counter the use of human shields during Q&A or whenever you're ready.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I'd like to just go, I think it's important to have a follow-up question because I think this would certainly interest many of our listeners and viewers from the United States. You said there was bipartisan support for this legislation. How is this legislation important to the Americans who are miles away from Hezbollah and Hamas rockets?
Sure. So It's a good question. And what's interesting about this is that the very same tactic that is being used against Israel is also being used against the United States. For example, the Islamic State and the Taliban have repeatedly used human shields against the United States. I'll give you an example. In August 2016, there were Islamic State fighters fleeing Manbij,
Lord?
We lost you.
Syria. Hear me? Can you hear me?
You're cracking, but keep going.
Okay. Sorry about that. The Islamic State and the Taliban repeatedly used human shields against the US. An example in Syria, Islamic State fighters lost a battle. How did they flee? They commandeered 500 vehicles, and in each vehicle, they put a civilian. Photos of the convoy that are publicly available show that the convoy was like sitting ducks, but US fighters didn't fire on the cars. They treated them all as non-combatants. The Islamic State fighters managed to escape and commit war crimes again another day. This is an example of what the US is facing. It's very similar to what Israel is facing in Hamas and with Hezbollah, hiding behind civilians. And so there's a real interest in addressing this, not only for purposes of the challenge to Israel, but also the challenge to US national security directly.
Thank you, Ord. Very clear. Sarit, I'd like to pose, if you will, a personal question. As a mother who lives in the Galilee border region in northern Israel, raising your children only 6 or 7 miles from the Lebanese border, what do you say to your children? How do you explain all this to them? And do you have shelters at home?
Well, in Israel, every home that was built after 1991 has a shelter, meaning that one of the rooms in the apartment, not in the building, in the apartment, is used as a shelter. It is made of concreted walls, iron door, iron window if they have a window. To be honest with you, behind me, this is a virtual background, but actually I am sitting in my shelter now, which is 2 square meters next to the kitchen. Meaning, by the way, that it is too far away from the children's bedrooms, and we have 9 seconds to run for shelter, which is not enough. So as a mother, when I heard the sirens, I was the most terrified person in the family. All the others were calm. The teenagers can run by themselves. I carried Alma. And my husband, who grew up in Nahariya and is used to the sounds of the Katyushas, came after 15 minutes and said, "What's going on? Is everybody okay?" So I think that even in Israel, people are not completely aware of the danger of the rockets as it is today. And they still have in mind the experience of the 80s and even the 2006, and the experience in the future will be different. To my children, I'm trying not to expose all of that. I feel very comfortable to do this in English rather than in Hebrew. Alma is coming with us to our tours along the border when we have hosts from abroad, and we take them, but we have guests, but again, I'm happy that this is all happening in English and she cannot understand everything. By the way, in Israel, children do experience exercises and training of how to run for shelter in school, at home. Twice a year, they have this kind of exercises, and they all know what they should do if they hear the sirens.
Right, right. That's something that we as Israelis who live in this part of the country, are very much drilled, and we know that our children are drilled too. So it makes life interesting, although I'm very biased, as you are, Sarit. We love this part of the country, and I don't think we'd change it for any other part of Israel. If I may, Ord, I'd like to come back to you and ask you, after the legislation was passed, what is now the greatest challenge? What kind of information is needed to fight the human shield tactic? And how can reports like this one that we heard this evening, how can it contribute? And finally, how is Hezbollah different from Hamas on this particular issue? Is there a difference at all?
Yes, thanks for your question. So Hamas is much more explicit. They're much, you might say, sloppier in their use of human shields. There are videos of Hamas leaders calling explicitly on Gaza civilians to serve as human shields. For example, going to the roof of a building. So with Hamas, it is relatively easy to say, oh, look, there's a violation of the prohibition against human shields, right? Sami Abu Zuhri, the Hamas spokesman, in this clip on this day told people to go to the roof. It's much harder with regard to Hezbollah. As Sarit mentioned, the Hezbollah leadership they're more careful in terms of what they say. We understand that there are missiles underneath houses, but it's difficult to prove it. There aren't photos of it. And even once you prove that there's a missile under the house, in order to punish somebody, you have to prove that that person was connected to it, who gave the order, etc. And this has all been very challenging with regard to calling Hezbollah out for using human shields and penalizing them. So this report is an important step forward, pointing the way to some places where there may indeed be human shields use by Hezbollah. And I hope that governments will take the report and take the next step, which is to verify using tools that only they have what is going on, and then publish and publicize and impose penalties as the new law requires the US government to do.
Okay, thank you for a question for you coming from Steve Hare in Northern Ireland. Good evening, Steve. Is this human shield legislation that was passed in the US Congress limited to the United States, or is it also law in the United Kingdom, Europe, and perhaps other parts of the world too?
So this is a very good question. International law, the prohibition against using human shields, binds pretty much every country on earth. And if you look in the UK, for example, there is a prohibition on UK soldiers using human shields or UK nationals using human shields. What the US law does, which is different, is that the US law imposes penalties on people using human shields, even if they have nothing to do with the United States. So if a Hamas leader is using human shields against Israel, they are subject to penalty under US law. My understanding is that no other country, certainly not the UK or Canada or any of our allies, has such a law, but we are hopeful that they will develop such laws. It is not just the United States and warfighters that have had trouble with human shields in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria. Our allies, such as the UK, have also come across this. And I've spoken to UK military officers who have found it incredibly frustrating. I've been working with NATO, and indeed there's a NATO initiative to push countries to adopt laws just like the law that we have in the United States. And so there's momentum to do that. And I encourage people in countries outside of the United States, in Europe, the UK, Canada, et cetera, to encourage their elected representatives to have laws the way we do. It's not only a US idea, it's now also a NATO idea. The NATO Supreme Allied Commander wrote a letter to all of the member states saying, we need to do more about the use of human shields. We need to impose punishments for it. We need to spotlight it. Here's how to do it. So this is something that can be built upon.
So, Ord, the sanctions to individuals, would you say that it's effective? Would you say that it's plausible and in the long term too?
Good question. So why do these terrorists engage in the use of human shields, right? They engage Hamas, Hezbollah, other terrorists, Islamic State, Taliban, engage in the actual war crime of using human shields so that they can falsely accuse Israeli and US armed forces of engaging in war crimes such as deliberate killing of civilians, right? They engage in the use of human shields, first of all, to cause our armed forces to self-impose restraints that render them less effective. And second of all, to erode the will to fight of us and our allies, right? The terrorists use human shields in order to spur anger at us and our allies. They do it in order to generate civilian casualties for which they then blame our forces. And this is a core element, certainly, of the campaign to delegitimize Israel, to demonize Israel. It involves incorrectly accusing the IDF of engaging in war crimes, including the deliberate killing of civilians. So when they do this, what we need to do is to push back in the court of public opinion and say, no, if there was a civilian killed here, it's because they were being used as a human shield by Hamas or Hezbollah. It's Hamas or Hezbollah's responsibility. And so in order to do this, right, I mean, you have to start holding terrorist groups accountable for using human shields. They use this tactic because the benefits outweigh the costs. The world sees a dead civilian, blames it on Israel, blames it on the United States. Now we're trying to change the calculus, right? And we change that calculus by pointing out what is going on and by imposing sanctions. Now, terrorists themselves may not care about economic sanctions, but their key supporters often do. If you're a leading Gaza businessman who provides services to Hamas, you want to avoid economic sanctions for the war crime of human shields use. If you are the chairman of the Hezbollah soccer team, who's maybe a big businessman in Lebanon and likes to travel to the United States and send your kids to college in the United States, has assets that go through the US financial system, you don't want to be pointed out by the US government for having engaged in the use of human shields, and you don't want to be shut out from the US and from the US financial system, which is what happens to you and your family if you're designated for the use of human shields.
Thank you, Or. Sarit, I'd like to ask you a question about Israel's response to human shields. I mean, we've been dealing with this for a very long time. I have a personal memory in the first Lebanon war when we were fighting the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and then we were witnessing human shields on the field. It was something extraordinary then, but it's been with us for a long time. And Israel has had to deal with this. Because this particular threat coming from these missiles is something we haven't actually faced before, does that change the strategy, both in terms of the political strategy of the government and perhaps also the military strategy of the Israel Defense Forces on this issue of human shields? Is something going to change in the doctrines, in the policies?
I think that the strategy developed, and it developed deeply in the past few years. I think the main event was the Goldstone report, when we understood after Oferet Yitzuka, I don't know the word in English, but in 2008, okay,
Operation
yes, in 2008-2009 operation in Gaza, and the fact that again, right after 3 years earlier, the second war with Lebanon, again, we couldn't achieve the operational achievement that we wanted because of the international pressure, and we were blamed for war crimes that, as Od just presented, the war crimes are of Hamas or Hezbollah, not ours. And I think this caused the IDF to take a different approach and develop, it takes years to develop a different approach, which expressed very well in the IDF strategy that was published in 2016 by the head chief of staff Eisenkot, that for the first time said legitimacy is one of the efforts of the IDF. meaning that IDF will be busy, or IDF units will be busy in this issue of legitimacy, whether it's information, whether it's assisting the diplomatic efforts of the government, and whether it's in wartime using the legalist to help the commanders make decisions, create specific orders, which, by the way, were also before that. Israel is putting a lot of efforts in all this issue of warning the population. And in 2006, and in these operations in Gaza since, Israel warned the population to go out of the war zones and to go away from Hezbollah sites or Hamas sites. And it's today with the internet, it's really easy to send all these messages to the population. And I think that, yes, many things change in the way IDF is viewing collateral damage and understanding that collateral damage is a problem of many aspects. One of them is the moral aspect, but it's not the only one. And that's why efforts are being done to cope with that, though there is no magic formula of how to avoid collateral damage. We all understand that in the next war, there will be casualties to both sides, by the way, but the uses of human shield will cause casualties also to the Lebanese side, no doubt about it.
Okay, thank you, Sarit. Well, I want to first of all thank Ord and Sarit for this interesting and very important live webinar from Alma's Research and Education Center. Thank you all for being with us today. Before we wrap up, I'd just like to add that if you appreciate the work of the Alma Research and Education Center, you can support us with whatever you can. Please check out our website, israel-alma.org, and then you can find out anything you need to know. If you enjoyed this session, you can also book a private webinar for your own group or for your organization. Our full program is on Alma's website, and we look forward to seeing you again. Obviously, now is not the time to travel, so we'll have to bring Israel's northern borders to you. We'll provide virtual tours with unique photos of the interesting sites along Israel's northern borders, where Iran's proxy Hezbollah are almost a few feet away from the border fence. So thank you for being with us again. I'm Natan Golan, live from the Western Galilee in the northern Israel for Alma. Shalom. We'll see you all soon.